When you look at a truly magnificent building, like a gleaming skyscraper or, I don't know, a grand historical monument, your eyes are naturally drawn upward.
Yeah, absolutely. You're looking at the skyline.
Right. You look at the glass catching the sunlight, the intricate stonework, the sheer, imposing scale of it all. And there is this expectation of permanence, of absolute
You
solidity.
just assume something so beautiful and so powerful is built to last forever.
Exactly. It projects complete invincibility.
It's designed to make you trust the facade.
But that tension between outward glory and, well, inward rot, that is exactly what happened to the greatest empire of the ancient Middle East.
Mm.
Because if you bring a structural engineer into that skyscraper, they bypass the marble lobbies, they go down into the dark, unglamorous basement, and they shine a flashlight on the foundation.
And that's where the illusions shatter.
It totally shatters. They find hairline fractures in the concrete. They find water seeping in. They find that the spectacular weight of the building is actually crushing the very pillars meant to support it.
Which is a perfect metaphor for what we're getting into today.
It really is. Today, we are going on a deep dive into a comprehensive document titled Survey of First Kings by Chris R. Velasquez. And what we have here is not just, a dry list of ancient monarchs.
No, not at all.
It is an absolute masterclass on how a nation dies from the inside out.
And, it's crucial to understand the environment in which this text was finalized. This isn't a celebratory history written at the height of an empire's power.
The timing is everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The scholarly consensus places the final shaping of this book in the 6th century BCE, likely during or shortly after the Babylonian exile.
Which was a massive trauma.
Oh, unimaginably traumatic. Just imagine the psychological state of the original audience. These are Judeans who have lost literally everything.
Yeah.
Their capital city, Jerusalem, has been completely sacked. The majestic temple, the absolute center of their universe, is reduced to smoking rubble. The monarchy has been wiped out, and they've been forcibly relocated hundreds of miles away to Babylon.
So they're sitting in the ashes of their national identity. They have to be asking themselves, how did we get here? Did our God fail us?
Yes.
And maybe the most terrifying question of all, is the ancient promise that God made to King David's lineage officially dead?
Those are the exact existential questions driving the narrative.
Yeah.
First Kings is the theological explanation they desperately needed to make sense of the catastrophe.
Right.
In the Hebrew Bible, Kings was originally a single, unified scroll. It was only later divided into 1 and 2 Kings. It covers an incredibly volatile period, and it's designed to trace the structural fractures of the kingdom all the way back to its supposed golden era.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the story picks right up at a moment of extreme vulnerability, crossing the canonical bridge from 2 Samuel. King David, the great warrior poet, the conqueror, is dying. He's confined to his bed, shivering, unable to keep warm, and instantly the succession intrigue kicks off.
It does.
It's like a massive power vacuum opens up and the sharks just start circling the waters immediately.
It's a profoundly tense moment. The kingdom is unified on paper, sure, but the transition of power in the ancient world was incredibly fragile.
Because they didn't have strict rules for it, right?
Exactly. Primogeniture, the automatic rule that the oldest son inherits everything that wasn't strictly codified or respected in early Israel the way it was in, say, later European monarchies.
Which completely opens the door for David's oldest surviving son, Adonijah.
Right.
Adonijah looks around, sees his father fading, and thinks, well, I'm the obvious heir. So he doesn't wait for a formal decree from his dad. He attempts a preemptive coup.
Very bold move.
Very bold. He throws himself this massive, lavish coronation feast at a place called Unrogel. He invites the military commanders, the royal elites, his brothers, well, most of his brothers.
And we have to look at the logistics of that move, because En-Rogel was a vital spring located just south of Jerusalem.
It's about water.
Yes. In an agrarian, semi-arid society, controlling the water source is a profound demonstration of power. Hosting a feast, there wasn't just a nice dinner party.
Right, it was strategic.
Highly strategic. It was a highly ritualized political event. Sharing meat from sacrificed animals was a way of binding the guests to him in a covenant of loyalty. He brings in Joab, the commander of the army, and Abiathar, a key priest.
So he's securing the military and the church, basically?
Exactly. He is deliberately securing both the military and the religious establishment.
But he pointedly does not invite his younger half-brother, Solomon, or Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, or Nathan the prophet. And that oversight completely proves fatal to his coup.
Because they don't just sit around and wait.
No. Nathan and Bathsheba immediately launch a counter movement. They go right into David's bedchamber, inform the dying king of what's happening, and essentially force his hand.
Right.
David orders them to take Solomon down to Gihon, another critical spring, effectively counter-programming Adonijah's event, and they anoint Solomon king right then and there.
They blow the ram's horn. The crowd goes wild.
Yeah, the noise is so loud it literally shakes the ground. Adonijah hears the cheering from his own party and realizes he has been completely outmaneuvered.
What the text is doing here is establishing a profound theme, which is that the throne is mediated through covenant promise, not just political opportunism.
Okay, I see that.
God preserves the Davidic line through intrigue, prophecy, and royal legitimacy. Adonijah's self-coronation collapses because the throne of Israel isn't merely something you can, seize by force or by throwing the biggest feast.
I hear that, but I have to push back a little here.
Oh, sure.
Because when you actually look at how Solomon secures that throne once he's on it, it feels way less like a holy covenant and more like a corporate hostile takeover.
That's a very fair assessment.
Honestly, it reads like the third act of a mob movie. You look at chapter 2, and Solomon is just settling all family business in the most ruthless way possible. He systematically removes every single perceived threat to his power.
We'll take that mob analogy a step further because it perfectly captures the chilling efficiency of Solomon's early reign.
Right.
He doesn't just act out of blind rage. He uses the machinery of the state to execute his rivals.
Right. Let's go down the hit list because it's intense. First, he takes out Joab, the former top general. Joab actually runs into the sacred tent and grabs the horns of the altar, claiming sanctuary.
A desperate move.
Yeah, and Solomon has him struck down right there anyway. Then he deals with Abiathar the priest. He doesn't kill him, but he strips him of his priesthood and banishes him to a rural town, completely severing the old religious guard.
Effectively neutralizing him.
Right. Then there's Shimei, this political wild card from the previous dynasty. Solomon puts him under house arrest in Jerusalem, tells him if he ever crosses the city limits, he dies. And the minute Shimei slips up, Solomon executes him.
And of course, there's his own family.
Yeah, finally his own half-brother, Adonijah. Adonijah asks to marry one of David's former caretakers, and Solomon treats it as an act of treason and has him killed. For a guy who is supposed to go down in history as the ultimate wise king, his administration begins with a staggering amount of political bloodshed.
It really does.
Yeah.
And that brutal consolidation sets up the central tension of the entire narrative. The author actually wants you to feel that dissonance.
Wait, so the author isn't trying to, cover up the bloodshed?
Not at all.
If Solomon is supposed to be the paragon of wisdom, the template for the Golden Age, why does the text highlight all this ruthlessness right out of the gate?
To answer that, we have to introduce a critical concept that drives the entirety of 1 Kings. And that concept is theological historiography.
Theological historiography? I mean, that sounds incredibly academic.
It does sound a bit dry, but it's actually a brilliant subversive way of reading history. You see, the anonymous author of this book, often referred to by scholars as a Deuteronomistic historian, is not writing a neutral, objective chronicle of events.
Okay.
They are not a modern journalist trying to give an unbiased account. Nor are they writing typical ancient propaganda where the king is presented as a flawless divine being.
So what are they actually doing then?
They are evaluating, filtering, and judging political power through one very specific, uncompromising lens, and that is covenant fidelity.
Ah, I see.
They are constantly asking, how faithful is this king to the agreement God made with Israel at Mount Sinai? And they're using the book of Deuteronomy as their rubric.
Meaning they don't care about his GDP or how big his borders got if his spiritual allegiance was compromised.
Exactly. The economy doesn't matter if the theology is wrong. So let's look at Solomon's defining moment. The famous scene in chapter 3 where God appears to him in a dream and essentially offers him a blank check.
Right. Ask for whatever you want.
Yes. And Solomon, to his credit, doesn't ask for a long life or massive wealth or the death of his enemies. He asks for wisdom. And the Hebrew term used here is okma.
Okma.
Yes, okma. And it is vital we understand this word because our modern concept of wisdom is heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. We tend to think of wisdom as abstract intelligence.
Like a philosopher.
Exactly. We picture a detached philosopher sitting under a tree, pondering the ethereal forms of the universe, or just someone with an extraordinarily high IQ. But in the ancient Hebrew mindset, okma is deeply practical.
How so? What does it actually look like in practice?
It is the skill of craftsmanship, In fact, the same word, okma, is used in the book of Exodus to describe the artisans who had the physical skill to build the tabernacle.
Oh, wow.
It means competence. When Solomon asks for okma, he is asking for practical, covenantal competence. He is asking for the administrative discernment and the judicial skill required to rule God's people faithfully. He recognizes that the burden of the state is just too heavy for him to carry on his own.
And he gets it. I mean, he gets this incredible gift of Okma, and he immediately puts it to use.
He certainly does.
He organizes the kingdom, he sets up taxation districts, and of course he embarks on his legacy project, which is building the temple in Jerusalem. Chapters 5 through 8 give us this massive, sweeping account of the temple's construction, and the logistics are staggering.
Truly monumental.
He brings in international alliances, particularly with King Hiram of Tyre, to get access to Lebanese cedar timber. He amasses unimaginable wealth, and he drafts an enormous workforce to quarry the stones and build this permanent house for God.
And the dedication of the temple in chapter 8 is the absolute climax of this era. Solomon prays a remarkably profound prayer. He acknowledges that even the highest heavens cannot contain God, yet he asks God to place his name, his presence, in this specific building.
It's a beautiful moment.
It's a high watermark for Israel's history. But remember, the structural engineer we talked about earlier, the one looking for hairline fractures?
Right. The warning hidden within the glory.
Yes, because chapters 9 and 10 present this astonishing accumulation of wealth. Gold is pouring into Jerusalem by the ton. Thousands of horses and chariots are being imported from Egypt.
Just massive extravagance.
Exactly. And Solomon's taking a vast array of foreign wives, 700 wives, 300 concubines, largely to seal political and diplomatic alliances with neighboring kingdoms.
Which, to be fair, was standard practice.
Oh, absolutely. To any secular historian of the ancient Near East, Solomon looks like the most successful, sophisticated monarch on earth.
But our theological historian is looking at this balance sheet and hyperventilating.
Precisely. Because the author is cross-referencing Solomon's actions against the strict rules laid out for kings centuries earlier in Deuteronomy 17.
Right.
That text explicitly forbids the king of Israel from doing three things: multiplying horses, multiplying wives, and greedily multiplying silver and gold.
But why those three specific things? I mean, what's wrong with a strong cavalry, diplomatic marriages, and a booming treasury? Literally every ancient kingdom relied on those things to survive.
Because in the theology of Israel, those three things create a false sense of security. Multiplying horses meant relying on military might and forming alliances with Egypt, which is the very place God delivered them from.
Oh, right.
Multiplying wives meant entering into treaties that required adopting foreign gods, and multiplying gold meant heavily taxing your own people and trusting in wealth rather than divine providence. They were vectors of corruption.
And that brings us to the most tragic diagnostic term in the entire book. The Hebrew word lov, meaning heart.
Yes. The text ultimately says Solomon's heart was divided.
It does. In chapter 11, the verdict just drops like a hammer. The charge isn't merely that he married foreign women, it's that his heart, his love, which in ancient Hebrew thought was the center of will, intellect, and loyalty, was not wholly true to YHWH.
He literally begins building shrines for the gods of his political allies right on the hills facing Jerusalem.
Which is wild.
His giftedness, his incredible okma, did not prevent spiritual drift. The builder of the temple becomes the template for compromise.
It's an incredible bait and switch for the reader. You think you're reading a biography of the greatest king ever, and suddenly you realize it's actually an autopsy.
That's a great way to put it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. While Solomon was busy building this glittering, magnificent empire on the world stage, the hidden cost of that empire was quietly breaking the backs of ordinary people.
Which leads directly into the archaeological reality of what it actually took to construct Solomon's utopia. The mechanisms of his administration were entirely extractive.
Let's talk about those mechanisms, because we have to unearth the truth of how this society functioned. The text describes a system of centralized rule, massive taxation, and corvée labor. Now, corvée labor isn't a term we use much today.
No, it's not. Corvée labor is forced, unpaid labor drafted by the state. It's a form of taxation paid not in silver or grain, but in human sweat.
Wow.
The state mandates that you leave your land, your family, your harvest, and work on royal building projects for a set number of months each year.
So if I can use another modern analogy here, I picture Solomon's kingdom like one of these massive, shiny tech conglomerates. You know the kind.
Oh, definitely.
They have a pristine, futuristic headquarters in Silicon Valley, all glass and sustainable wood. Their CEO gives these brilliant keynotes, and their products are universally praised as a genius.
Right, the perfect public image.
Exactly. But then you investigate their supply chain. You trace the rare earth minerals back to their source, and you realize this entire multi-billion-dollar utopia is built on the backs of horribly mistreated laborers on the other side of the world, pulling 18-hour shifts in brutal
It is a
conditions.
very sharp analogy. The overwhelming shine at the top of the pyramid is designed to blind you to the suffering at the bottom.
And as I read this survey from Velocis, I find myself asking, is the text telling us to admire this golden age, or is it actually telling us to be horrified by it?
It is actively subverting typical ancient Near Eastern royal propaganda. In the ancient world, if you were a great king, you commissioned stone monuments specifically to boast about how much labor you extracted.
You wanted people to know.
Exactly. You bragged about how many enemies you enslaved and how much tribute you squeezed out of the provinces. That extraction was the very measure of your greatness. But First Kings turns that completely upside down. It portrays this massive extraction of labor and wealth as a fundamental breach of social reciprocity. The covenant demanded that the king protect the vulnerable, not exploit them to build bigger palaces.
So it's a critique of empire written from inside the empire. And it's fascinating because this isn't just a literary theme. We actually have an archaeological backdrop for what this highly centralized world looked like.
We do. Archaeology provides a crucial physical dimension to this narrative. However, we have to be careful. Biblical archaeology is rarely a simple X marks the spot validation of everything written in the text.
It's never that easy, is it?
No, it's a complex, highly debated science.
Let's look at a specific example from the source, the Solomonic Gates. 1 Kings 9 mentions that Solomon used this forced labor to build up three key strategic cities, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer.
Yes. And for decades, this was considered one of the great triumphs of biblical archaeology. Excavators found these massive, identical, six-chambered monumental gates at all three of those exact locations.
Which seems like a slam dunk.
It really did. For a long time, the prevailing scholarly consensus was enthusiastic. They dated them to the 10th century BCE and said, look, here is the physical proof of Solomon's centralized, state-sponsored building program, exactly as the text describes.
But then, as always seems to happen in archaeology, somebody comes along and says, not so fast.
That's the nature of the discipline. Other archaeologists came in, re-examined the stratigraphy, which is the specific layers of earth and ruins, and they challenged that conclusion.
How so?
Well, you see, stones don't come with timestamps. To date a wall, you have to date the organic material or the specific styles of pottery found in the dirt layers immediately beneath and beside that wall.
And what did the new analysis show?
It sparked a massive ongoing debate. Some scholars argue that the carbon dating and the pottery typology pushed the construction of those massive gates forward to the 9th century BCE.
Wait, so not Solomon.
Right. If that's true, it means they weren't built by Solomon at all. They would have been built by a later northern king named Omri, who we'll talk about shortly. The debate between a 10th century Solomonic date and a 9th century Omride date remains fiercely unresolved in the academic community today.
Which is a great reminder that archaeology requires interpretation. But what about the crown jewel? What about the Temple of Solomon itself? Surely we have archaeological data for the most important building in the text.
Actually, we have absolutely none.
None. Seriously.
Zero direct archaeological evidence, because the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is a site of immense modern religious and political sensitivity. It is holy to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity.
Right, you can't just go digging there.
Exactly. You cannot simply walk in there with shovels, pickaxes, and ground-penetrating radar to dig up the esplanade. Any scholarly reconstruction of Solomon's temple relies entirely on the literary descriptions in the biblical text, and comparative archaeology looking at similar temples built by neighboring cultures in Syria or Phoenicia during the same period to guess at the floor plans and architectural styles.
But that is wild. The center of the narrative is essentially a ghost in the archaeological record. But we do have other finds that vividly confirm the kind of oppressive, centralized bureaucracy that Solomon started, right?
Yes, absolutely. We have concrete evidence of the system itself,
Okay.
specifically the Samaria Ostraka.
Ostraka. That's kind of a fancy word for ancient scrap paper, right?
Essentially, yes. An ostrakon is a piece of broken pottery that was used as a writing surface. Before the invention of cheap paper, broken potsherds were everywhere.
Oh, that makes sense.
Scribes would use them with ink to record daily, mundane transactions. In the ruins of Samaria, the later capital of the Northern Kingdom, Archaeologists uncovered a cache of these ostraca dating to the early 8th century BCE.
And what do they tell us? Are they like poetry? Historical annals?
They are far more boring and therefore far more revealing. They are administrative receipts.
Receipts.
Yes. They record deliveries of luxury goods, specifically fine oil and vintage wine, coming from various surrounding rural states and clan territories directly into the royal palace in the capital.
So it's a literal paper trail of the taxation system.
Uh-huh.
It's the ancient equivalent of an Excel spreadsheet tracking wealth being funneled out of the countryside, away from the farmers who produced it, and directly into the pockets of the royal elite.
You're hitting on the exact reason these finds are so important. Scholars point out that these ostraca are evidence of a highly organized palace bureaucracy and limited literacy. The scribes working for the king controlled the flow of information and the flow of goods. It represents a total shift from a tribal, kin-based society where communities took care of themselves to a state-based economy where the center extracts from the periphery.
And that dynamic, the center bleeding the periphery dry, is a ticking time bomb. Solomon's economic miracle could only sustain itself as long as the people were willing to endure the crushing weight of it. When Solomon finally dies around 930 BCE, all that repressed generational anger from the working class immediately explodes. The foundation finally cracks.
Which brings us to the catastrophic event known as the division of the kingdom.
Solomon dies, and his son, Rehoboam, travels to the city of Shechem to be crowned. Now, the northern tribes of Israel see an opportunity. They come to Rehoboam, and they don't ask for a revolution.
No, they're very measured.
They essentially say, look, your father put a heavy, brutal yoke of forced labor and taxation on us. If you lighten this burden, if you give us some basic economic relief, we will serve you. It is a completely reasonable, rational request.
It is. And Rehoboam asks for 3 days to think it over. First, he consults with the older, experienced counselors who had served his father.
The guys who actually know how to run a country.
Exactly. These men understand statecraft. They understand the simmering resentment. They advise him, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. It's brilliant advice. Power requires humility to maintain stability.
But Rehoboam doesn't like that answer. So he goes to his peers, the young men he grew up with in the insulated bubble of royal privilege. These are guys who have never worked a day of corvée labor in their lives. They've only known wealth and power.
And their advice is rooted purely in ego and a display of dominance. They tell him to double down, to show absolute, uncompromising strength.
And he actually listens to the frat brothers. He comes back to the representatives of the northern tribes and arrogantly delivers one of the most disastrous political speeches in all of recorded history.
It really is.
He says, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions."
With scorpions, likely referring to a type of cruel barbed whip, it's a profound, spectacular failure of leadership. Rehoboam's refusal to lighten the burden is a complete rejection of covenant responsibility. He views the people merely as resources to be exploited, not as subjects to be protected.
And the fracture is instantaneous. The northern tribes immediately secede. They shout, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel." It's a total national divorce.
The unified empire is gone forever.
It really is. It splits into two rival nations. You've got the kingdom of Judah in the south, ruled by Rehoboam with Jerusalem as its capital, and the kingdom of Israel in the north.
And the northern kingdom elevates a man named Jeroboam to be their king.
Now, Jeroboam has a massive strategic problem right out of the gate. He has the majority of the territory, he has 10 of the tribes, he has the agricultural wealth, but he lacks the one thing that holds the national identity together.
Right. He doesn't have the theological center. The temple is in Jerusalem, which is now the capital of a hostile foreign nation.
Exactly. And Jeroboam is terrified. The text gives us his internal monologue. He thinks, if my people keep crossing the border, going down to Jerusalem on pilgrimage to worship at the temple, their hearts are eventually going to turn back to the dynasty of David. They'll realize they share a religion with the South, they'll regret the split, and they'll assassinate me.
It's a very astute political calculation. Pilgrimage in the ancient world wasn't just about personal devotion. It was the engine of the economy.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, when people traveled for festivals, they brought tithes, they bought sacrifices, they paid for lodging, and they exchanged ideas. Jeroboam realizes that if Jerusalem controls the worship, Jerusalem eventually controls the economy and the loyalty of his people.
So he comes up with a plan to stop the bleeding. He establishes rival worship centers within his own borders. He puts one in the far north at a city called Dan. and one in the south at a city called Bethel, right on the border with Judah.
A very strategic placement.
Extremely. And inside these shrines, he places 2 golden calves. He tells the people, "It is too much trouble for you to go all the way up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt."
We really need to unpack the brilliance and the disaster of this move.
Well, I think about it like a modern tech CEO who realizes all his users are spending their time on a competitor's app. So he creates a completely closed-loop rival social media ecosystem.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, he builds his own platform, curates his own content, and tweaks the algorithm so that his the worshipers, never have any logistical reason to click over to Jerusalem. He intercepts the northern traffic at Dan, and he intercepts the southern traffic at Bethel. He keeps all the user engagement, all the loyalty, completely internal.
That analogy perfectly highlights the manipulative nature of his strategy. The shrines were the algorithm designed to prevent churn. But what's fascinating here is that there's a major debate among historians and theologians about what Jeroboam was actually doing with these golden calves.
Wait, Jeroboam building shrines just sounds like standard border security, statecraft. Every ancient king built temples to secure their territory. And didn't they learn anything from the Exodus? Why build calves again? Was he actually trying to introduce Egyptian cow gods to Israel? Or was this just a cynically brilliant political move?
That is the core of the debate. Many scholars argue that Jeroboam wasn't introducing new foreign gods at all. In ancient Near Eastern iconography, deities were rarely depicted directly. Instead, they were often shown standing invisibly on the backs of powerful animals.
Okay, so the animal is like a throne.
Yes, the Canaanite god Baal, for example, was often depicted standing on a bull.
So the calf wasn't the god itself.
Exactly. Some scholars argue these golden calves were merely intended to be symbolic pedestals, an unauthorized, illicit way of representing YHWH, the God of Israel. Jeroboam was essentially offering an alternative to the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem.
Oh, wow.
He was telling the people, we are still worshiping the God of the Exodus, we just have a more convenient, locally sourced location.
But the author of First Kings doesn't care about his nuanced theological justifications, do they?
Not in the slightest. Regardless of his original intent, whether it was outright polytheism or just illicit representation, the text judges it as catastrophic treason against the covenant. This act introduces the concept of the Bama, the high places.
The localized shrines. But why was centralized worship so critical?
Because in 1 Kings, worship is a socio-political act. You cannot separate theology from politics. The covenant demanded centralized worship at the place God chose to put his name to ensure the purity of the religion and the unity of the people.
So you can't just make up your own rules.
No. Statecraft cannot justify false worship. Jeroboam thinks he is cleverly securing his dynasty, but the text explicitly states that these rival shrines become a sin that inherently destabilizes the northern state, dooming his entire lineage.
And it sets a horrific, inescapable precedent. Every single northern king after him is judged by this standard. The text constantly repeats the refrain, "He walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin."
Over and over.
The northern kingdom just spirals from there. The source document outlines a dizzying, rapid dynastic turnover. Assassinations, coups, kings ruling for a week before being murdered. It is pure chaos. Until finally, we get to a king named Omri in the early 9th century BCE.
Right. And Omri is a fascinating case study in how secular history and biblical history collide.
Because historically, Omri was an absolute powerhouse, right? We mentioned him earlier as the possible builder of those massive gates. He finally stabilized the north. He founded a dynasty that lasted 4 generations.
He really did.
He bought a hill and built a magnificent new capital city called Samaria. He put Israel on the geopolitical map. The source notes that even the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which is an incredible Assyrian artifact you can go see in the British Museum today, it refers to the entire nation of Israel, decades later, simply as the House of Omri.
Which is incredible. From a secular geopolitical perspective, Omri was arguably one of the greatest state builders in Israel's history. He established trade, military dominance, and international recognition.
But you read First Kings, and the author gives this giant of history, half a dozen verses?
Barely that.
The text basically summarizes his entire 50-year legacy by saying, he built Samaria, he did more evil than everyone before him, he died. It completely trivializes his massive political success because of his spiritual apostasy.
Which perfectly reinforces the book's central thesis. Political success, wealth, and military stability do not equal covenant approval. In fact, they often mask profound spiritual decay. And Omri's son is the one who really pushes the kingdom over the edge, King Ahab.
Right, and his infamous queen, Jezebel.
Yes.
And as the throne becomes entirely institutionally corrupt, a new force has to rise up to challenge it. The system is broken, so God sends in the wild cards. We enter the era of the prophet.
We do. And the conflict that erupts here is not a polite philosophical disagreement.
No, Ahab and Jezebel don't just tolerate alternative worship the way Jeroboam did. Jezebel is a Phoenician princess. Their marriage is a strategic alliance to secure trade routes to the Mediterranean Sea. And with that alliance comes her religion.
It's a package deal.
Exactly. They actively sponsor the worship of Baal and Asherah. They institutionalize it as the state religion, and they begin systematically hunting down the prophets of YHWH.
We have to clarify the exact nature of this conflict, too. It is not a modern debate of atheism versus belief in a generic deity. It is a life-or-death struggle for exclusive covenant loyalty. And we have to understand who Baal was to understand the mechanics of this war.
Right, Baal wasn't just a generic idol.
No, Baal was the Canaanite storm god. He was the rider of the clouds. He was believed to control the rain, the lightning, and the fertility of the crops. Now, remember the geography of the Levant. Unlike Egypt, which relied on the predictable flooding of the Nile River, the agriculture in Israel was entirely dependent on seasonal rainfall.
So if it didn't rain?
If it didn't rain, the crops died. If the crops died, the livestock died. If the livestock died, the people starved. In this agrarian society, the God who controls the rain literally controls life and death.
So when a lone prophet named Elijah suddenly bursts onto the scene in chapter 17, his opening move is a highly targeted, calculated attack on Baal's resume.
Oh, perfectly targeted.
Elijah walks right into Ahab's court and announces, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." He doesn't just preach a sermon, he declares economic and meteorological warfare.
He really does.
He is throwing down the gauntlet, proving that YHWH, not the storm god Baal, controls the skies.
It is a direct theological assault. He shuts off the tap, and what happens next is incredibly poignant. During this severe multi-year drought that ravages the land, God sends Elijah into hiding.
Right, for his safety.
But he doesn't send him to a wealthy Israelite patron in the south. He sends him completely outside of Israel's borders to a town called Zarephath, located on the Phoenician coast.
Which is literally Jezebel's home turf. It's the epicenter of Baal worship.
Exactly. He sends the prophet of YHWH deep behind enemy lines. And there, Elijah is sustained not by a king, but by a poor, starving Gentile widow who is gathering sticks to cook one final meal for her and her son before they die. The theological significance here is profound.
Because it shows that God's power isn't limited by geography.
Yes. The widow at Zarephath receives life and an endless supply of flour and oil because she trusts the word of YHWH. It proves that God's provision and sovereignty extend far outside the borders of Israel, even to the most vulnerable Gentiles in the heart of Baal territory.
It's an amazing story.
It's a theme of radical mercy that Jesus himself explicitly recalls centuries later in the Gospel of Luke, much to the anger of his hometown crowd.
But Elijah can't stay hidden in Phoenicia forever. Eventually, 3 years into this devastating drought, the economy is collapsing, and God tells Elijah to go show himself to King Ahab. And this leads to arguably the most famous theatrical showdown in all of ancient literature, Mount Carmel.
1 Kings chapter 18. It is the theological climax of the entire divided kingdom narrative.
It is pure cinematic drama. Elijah challenges Ahab to bring all 450 state-sponsored prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel for a public test. They set up 2 altars with sacrifice bulls, and Elijah lays out the terms. He says, "You call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God."
It's a brilliant test because lightning is supposed to be Baal's signature weapon.
Exactly. He's fighting Baal on his own terms. So the prophets of Baal go first, and they spend all morning and all afternoon praying, shouting, dancing wildly around the altar. They even resort to cutting themselves with swords and spears, which was a desperate ritualistic attempt to bleed and compel the deity to answer.
Very gruesome.
And while they are doing this, Elijah is just ruthlessly mocking them.
The Hebrew text is actually quite sharp and sarcastic there.
He says, "Shout louder, maybe he's deep in thought or busy." Actually, doesn't the original language imply something a bit more vulgar? Like, maybe he's relieving himself in the restroom?
Yes, the Hebrew euphemism strongly suggests that. Elijah implies Baal is either asleep, traveling, or using the bathroom. He is stripping away all the majesty of the state religion.
And of course, there is no answer, no fire, just exhausted, bleeding prophets. Then, as evening approaches, Elijah steps up. He repairs the broken altar of YHWH using 12 stones, symbolizing the unified tribes. Then he does something completely counterintuitive.
Right, with the water.
Yes. In the middle of a catastrophic drought, he has them dig a trench around the altar and orders them to drench his sacrifice in precious water 3 separate times.
He is making it scientifically impossible to ignite naturally.
He steps forward and prays a simple, quiet, covenant-focused prayer. No dancing, no cutting, just a request for God to prove who he is so the people's hearts will turn back. And immediately, fire falls from heaven.
Just consumed instantly.
It consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and licks up every drop of water in the trench. The people are terrified. They fall on their faces and cry out, "The Lord, he is God." It is an absolute, undeniable, superhero-level public victory for Elijah. He then executes the prophets of Baal and prays for the rain to return, which it finally does.
It proves definitively that YHWH is supreme over nature, over the state, and over Baal. It is a stunning triumph.
And this is where I'm completely, utterly baffled by the narrative. Because you turn the page to chapter 19, immediately after this epic victory, and Elijah experiences this massive, confusing, emotional whiplash.
It is quite jarring.
Word gets back to the palace. Queen Jezebel is furious, and she sends Elijah a message. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." It's a death threat.
A very serious one.
And Elijah, the man who just stared down a king, mocked 450 false prophets, and called fire from the sky, suddenly cracks. He is terrified. He runs for his life, leaves his servant behind, travels deep into the wilderness, collapses under a broom tree, and basically begs God to let him die. He says, "I have had enough, take my life."
He hits rock bottom.
He is completely depleted. Why on earth does the author include this? It feels like it ruins the hero's arc. Why show your greatest prophet acting like a coward?
I love that you brought that up because it is one of the most raw, realistic, and profoundly human moments in all of ancient literature. The author isn't interested in a two-dimensional superhero. What's fascinating here is how the text leans deeply into practical theology and human physiology. Elijah's collapse in chapter 19 is a canonical case study in burnout.
Burnout. That feels like such a modern corporate concept to apply to an ancient prophet.
But it accurately describes the physiological and psychological crash he experiences. Think about the physical toll of Mount Carmel. The adrenaline rush, the spiritual fervor, the sheer physical exertion of the confrontation, and then running ahead of Ahab's chariot in the rain. When that massive adrenaline dump wears off, his body simply shuts down.
And the psychological reality hits him. He won the battle, but Jezebel still controls the army.
Exactly. We also have to view this through the sociological context of the ancient Near East, which is the honor-shame dynamic. A king's honor was a highly guarded public commodity. Yet here you have lone prophets, the Hebrew word is navi, who continually step into the public square and publicly shame these powerful kings with divine truth.
That's got to be incredibly stressful.
It takes an unimaginable psychological toll on the prophet. Elijah was carrying the weight of a nation's apostasy on his shoulders. He thought Mount Carmel would spark a total national revival, but the systemic power of the state didn't budge, so he breaks.
So how does God handle a severely burnt-out, depressed prophet who wants to quit? He doesn't yell at him, he doesn't give him a lecture on faith or tell him to toughen up.
No. The text shows incredible divine tenderness. God handles the physical crisis first. He lets Elijah sleep. He sends an angel to wake him up, not with a new mission, but with freshly baked bread and a jar of water.
A snack and a nap.
Literally. He tells him to eat and then lets him go back to sleep. He sustains him physically and gives him space to recover before he ever addresses the spiritual crisis. The profound lesson here is that public triumph and private depletion often coexist. Even the strongest servants of God require grace, rest, and physical restoration after the contest.
That is deeply resonant. It's an exploration of human limits. So God restores Elijah, speaks to him in a gentle whisper rather than a fire or earthquake, and gives him a new commission to anoint the next generation of leaders because the resistance isn't over. The prophets didn't just care about who you prayed to on a mountain. They cared deeply about how you treated your neighbor in the valley.
Which leads us into the darkest, most revealing chapter of Ahab's entire reign. It exposes the true rot of his administration.
Let's examine this event, the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21, because the parallels to modern governmental corruption are terrifying.
They really are.
Ahab is the king. He has massive wealth, multiple palaces. But he looks out his window from his winter palace in Jezreel, and he sees a vineyard next door that he wants to turn into a vegetable garden. The vineyard belongs to a regular working-class citizen named Naboth. Ahab goes to Naboth and offers a seemingly fair deal. Give me your vineyard, and I will give you a better one in exchange, or I will pay you its value in silver.
To a modern reader, this sounds like a standard real estate transaction, like a developer making a generous offer to a homeowner.
Right, it feels like an eminent domain buyout. But Naboth flatly refuses. He tells the king, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." Why is Naboth so stubborn? Why not just take the cash and buy a bigger farm?
Because we have to understand the Israelite theology of land. In the Torah, specifically codified in the Jubilee laws, land was not commercial real estate. It wasn't a commodity to be bought and sold for profit.
It was more than that.
Much more. The land belonged to YHWH, and it was leased to the tribes and families as a sacred inheritance, a Nahala. It was tied to your family's identity and their covenant with God. To permanently sell your ancestral land to the crown was to sever your family's place in the covenant community. Naboth is acting out of deep religious conviction, not financial stubbornness.
Ahab understands this rule, but he doesn't like it. He goes home, lies down on his bed, turns his face to the wall, and literally refuses to eat. The king of Israel is throwing a temper tantrum because he can't have a vegetable garden.
Which is when Queen Jezebel steps in. And she represents a completely different Canaanite philosophy of royal prerogative. She looks at her sulking husband and asks, "Are you the king over Israel or not? Get up and eat. I will get you the vineyard of Naboth."
And her method for getting it is chillingly sophisticated. She doesn't just send an assassin in the night. That would look like tyranny. Instead, she weaponizes the legal system to murder Naboth legally. Let's look at the mechanics of this conspiracy.
Very dark.
She writes letters in Ahab's name to the elders of Naboth's city. She orders them to proclaim a public fast and seat Naboth at the head of the assembly. Why a fast?
In the ancient world, a public fast was called when the community believed a severe sin had been committed that was bringing divine wrath upon the city like a plague or a famine. By calling a fast, she immediately injects a sense of fear and paranoia into the community. They're looking for a scapegoat.
And then she springs the trap. She has two scoundrels sit opposite Naboth and publicly testify against him, claiming Naboth has cursed both God and the king. Why two witnesses?
Because she is cynically using Deuteronomy's own laws against the covenant people. The law required at least two witnesses to secure conviction for a capital offense. She subverts the mechanism of justice to commit murder.
The local elders, who are either terrified of Jezebel or corrupt themselves, go along with it. Naboth is convicted of blasphemy and treason. He is taken outside the city and stoned to death. And because he was executed as a traitor to the state, his property is confiscated and reverts to the crown.
It's just brutal.
Jezebel goes to Ahab and says, "Naboth is dead. Go take possession of your vineyard." Ahab gets exactly what he wanted.
To understand the theological gravity of this horrifying event, we need to look at another crucial Hebrew word highlighted in our source material. Mishpo.
Mishpo.
Yes.
Right.
It translates to justice or righteous judgment. In the theology of 1 Kings, true kingship must be grounded in Mishpo. The king is not above the law. The king is supposed to be the chief administrator of God's law, protecting the weak from the strong. What Jezebel and Ahab do here is completely shatter the foundation of the covenant.
They use the machinery of the law to commit theft and state-sponsored murder.
Exactly. The text is making a profound argument that echoes through the ages. Abuse of power, perjury, corrupt courts, and land theft are not just private sins or the unavoidable cost of doing political business. They are severe covenant crimes against God himself.
Wow.
The integrity of a witness and the protection of private property matter deeply to God. The moral legitimacy of a ruler in this book depends entirely on mishpat, on justice. It does not depend on their approval ratings, their economic policies, or the scale of their military power.
And God's response to this injustice is immediate. He sends Elijah right into that stolen vineyard. Just as Ahab is walking the property lines, enjoying his new garden, Elijah appears. Ahab says, "So you have found me, my enemy."
A very dramatic entrance.
Elijah delivers a massive, devastating indictment. He prophesies the gruesome end of Ahab's dynasty, predicting that dogs will lick up his blood and devour Jezebel.
And while Ahab shows a brief, surprising moment of superficial repentance, he actually tears his clothes and fasts. He ultimately meets the doom Elijah predicted.
Which brings us to his death in chapter 22. Ahab forms an alliance with the king of Judah to go into battle and reclaim some territory in Ramoth-Gilead. But before they go, they consult the prophets. Ahab gathers 400 court prophets. These are men on the state payroll, and they all unanimously tell the king exactly what he wants to hear. Go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king.
It's the ultimate echo chamber.
But the king of Judah asks if there is a true prophet of YHWH they can ask. Ahab begrudgingly brings out a man named Micaiah, complaining, I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad.
He's the only one telling the truth.
And Micaiah stands against the consensus of 400 men and tells the absolute truth. He describes a vision of Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd. He explicitly prophesies Ahab's death.
This highlights another major takeaway from the historical survey. Truth may be outvoted, but it remains true. Prophetic truth constantly overrides court consensus. Micaiah's integrity, even when it leads to him being slapped in the face and thrown into prison on bread and water, stands in sharp, brilliant contrast to the sycophants surrounding the king.
Ahab tries to cheat the prophecy. He goes into battle, but he disguises himself as a regular soldier, hoping to avoid being targeted, while having the king of Judah wear royal robes. He thinks he can outsmart God.
But he can't.
But during the battle, an enemy archer draws his bow at random, literally drew his bow at a venture, the text says, and fires an arrow into the air. It strikes Ahab perfectly in the tiny gap between the joints of his armor. He bleeds out in his chariot as the sun goes down, and later, when they wash his blood from the chariot, the dogs lick it up, exactly as Elijah warned.
It's an incredibly bleak, sobering picture.
By the time we reach the end of 1 Kings, the situation feels utterly hopeless. Ahab is dead. His incompetent son Ahaziah is taking over. The true prophets are marginalized or hiding, and the kingdom is fractured, corrupt, and bleeding.
Which brings us to the final horizon of our analysis. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the long view of redemptive history.
Yeah.
Because you just stop at the last verse of 1 Kings, it feels like an unrelenting tragedy.
It really does. It's like ending a movie right when the heroes are losing, the villain's cronies are still in charge, and the city is burning down. But as our text points out, there's a kind of theological post-credits scene playing out under the surface, hinting that the story isn't totally over.
We have to remember those original readers we talked about at the beginning, the exiles sitting in Babylon. They're reading this dark history, and they need to know, is the promise God made to David dead? Did the failures of Solomon and Rehoboam and Ahab cancel the covenant? And the overarching theme of the book tells us that while God's judgment on idolatry and injustice is severe and real, God is also actively preserving a remnant.
The phrase that keeps echoing through the text is, for David's sake.
Precisely. Even when Solomon failed and his heart divided, God didn't tear the entire kingdom away from his son, specifically for the sake of David, my servant. Even when subsequent kings of Judah faltered and introduced idolatry, God maintained a lamp in Jerusalem for David's sake. The author is constantly pointing back to 2 Samuel 7, the foundational covenant where God promised David an everlasting throne.
And we know historically that this Davidic line wasn't just a myth. It was a real, internationally recognized dynasty.
Yes, and archaeology confirms the historical footprint of this era beautifully. Consider the Tel Dan stele. It was discovered in northern Israel, dating to the 9th century BCE. It's an Aramaic stone inscription set up by a foreign king boasting of his military victories over Israel. But the crucial detail is that it explicitly boasts of killing kings from the house of David. It is the first extra-biblical confirmation that Israel's enemies recognize the Davidic dynastic claim.
And there's also the Mesha stele, right?
Yeah. Yes. The Mesha stele, or the Moabite stone. It sheds light on the geopolitical conflicts of this exact era, giving us the Moabite king's perspective on his rebellion against Israel following Ahab's death. These stones anchor the text in genuine ancient history. The geopolitics were real.
But the ultimate meaning of the text goes far beyond geopolitics. It's theological. It's pointing somewhere.
It is deeply eschatological. It looks forward to the end of the story. If you read 1 Kings through a Christological lens, which is how the New Testament authors read it, you see that the book judges the monarchy by Deuteronomy's terms, and it finds every single human king profoundly lacking.
Which creates a massive, agonizing gap. Israel needs a true king, but human nature keeps failing them.
Exactly. The patterns of failure point forward to the need for ultimate fulfillment. Look at the Ark of Solomon. He is the wise son of David who builds the glorious temple, but he fails morally and his heart divides. In the New Testament, Jesus is presented as the greater son of David, the one who brings true, uncorrupted wisdom. Jesus builds a kingdom without idolatry. He even redefines the temple itself. In the Gospel of John, Jesus refers to his own body as the true temple, saying, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up."
And Elijah's pattern points forward, too.
Yes. Elijah's entire ministry, his bold confrontation of corrupt state power, his time suffering in the wilderness, his fiery preaching calling for repentance, perfectly anticipates the ministry of John the Baptist. John dresses like Elijah, preaches like Elijah, and prepares the way for Christ.
The gospel logic of this ancient text is essentially this. The human kings fail, the human prophets testify and burn out. The stone temple cannot save the people from their own sins. And therefore, humanity needs a king far greater than Solomon, a prophet far greater than Elijah, and a sanctuary far greater than a building made of cedar and stone.
The book does not end in despair. It ends in eager anticipation. It forces the reader to look past the broken human institutions, past the corrupt politicians and the compromised religious leaders, and look for the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise in a true, righteous king.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by looking at the illusion of Solomon's golden age, realizing that a magnificent facade of wealth and power often hides a cracking, extractive foundation. We explored the mechanics of that extraction, the corvée labor, the taxation, and how it triggered the devastating split of the kingdom through Rehoboam's arrogance.
We really went deep.
We analyzed Jeroboam's cynically weaponized religious algorithm, designed to keep his citizens trapped in his territory. We stood on Mount Carmel as Elijah fought an economic and theological war against Baal, and we sat with him in the dirt as he broke under the physiological weight of burnout. And we watched the horrifying reality of state-enabled theft in Naboth's vineyard, where the legal system was twisted to serve the greed of the elite, proving that justice, mishpah, is non-negotiable to God.
It is a sweeping, complex, and tragic narrative. But the final lesson we extract from this deep dive is profound in its simplicity. Practical wisdom, okma, without covenant faithfulness, inevitably becomes self-deception. Calling, gifting, and outward societal success absolutely do not prevent spiritual drift.
Which leads me to a final thought I want to leave you, our listener, to mull over on your own. Throughout the entire text of 1 Kings, the author evaluates every single ruler with a recurring regnal formula. It's a simple, cut-and-dry summary statement declaring whether they did evil or did right in the sight of the Lord. And here's the kicker. That final historical evaluation is based entirely on their covenant loyalty.
Nothing else.
Right. It has absolutely nothing to do with their GDP, the size of their military, the beauty of their building projects, or their political charisma. Omri built an empire, and the text dismisses him as a failure. So I want you to think about this. If your life were evaluated today by your ultimate loyalties, not your resume, not your bank account, and certainly not the glittering public image you project to the world, what would your formula say? We live in a culture that is completely obsessed with the facade, with outward measurable success. But when the structural engineer goes down into the basement of your life to inspect the foundation, what will they find? Is your heart unified in its loyalty to what is true and just? Or, like the great, wise, and tragic King Solomon, is it divided? Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Until next time, keep digging beneath the surface.